to highlight what I've learned from my sometimes successful attempts and other times not so successful attempts to be a better servant in the field of education, whose purpose is to work on behalf of others, particularly those who have been historically marginalized. Last year, a piece that I co-wrote with a friend and colleague, Dr. Mark Hicks, who's now at the Union Theological Seminary, was published in the Handbook of Social Foundations of Education. And in that piece, Mark and I describe our efforts to work with well-intentioned colleagues on issues of social justice across differences, all kinds of difference, whether it's race, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, gender, sexual orientation, even region, right? And I'm originally from Richmond, Virginia, and so those of you who've moved around the country know that sometimes even where you live, where you're from, can create barriers to how you work with and how effective you are in working with people. In any event, that piece was our very public attempt to use our personal and professional narratives to highlight our expectations and definitions of social justice and how they're rooted in our lived experiences, in our personal stories. And I want to share the beginning of that piece because it sets a theoretical framework for how I'm talking about my own narrative today. W.E.B. Du Bois, his epic narrative, The Souls of Black Folks, published in 1903, richly characterizes the legacy of social, psychological, and economic hardship for African Americans of the era. In describing that experience, Du Bois coined the psychic phenomena of double consciousness. I think you all may be familiar with that, where African Americans sought to neutralize notions of inferiority and hopelessness in a backdrop of white supremacy. In Du Bois's mind, the best route to dismantle racism was for African Americans to ground themselves in their African and Negro culture before attempting to navigate the larger society. By centering the positive effects of African and Negro culture, African Americans would be in a position to navigate the racial stratifications of American society and challenge racism all at the same time. The practical wisdom of this philosophical approach so captured the imaginations of Black people that it gelled social patterns of imagination and thought for years. Fast forward 60 years later to Martin Luther King Jr. sitting on a wooden bench in the Birmingham City Jail, 1963. In that moment of solitude, he's struggling with the legacy and experience of double consciousness. During this dark hour of the civil rights movement, King is discerning what it meant to be simultaneously Negro and American in the struggle for a place at the table of American social life. In 1903, Du Bois believed that the development of double consciousness could lead to a self-affirming way for Blacks to transcend the boundaries of race. In 1963, King, challenged by anxious co-workers, he said, and he wrote in the letter from the Birmingham jail, that regardless of race affiliation, all of humanity is, and I quote, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. King, in a moment of prophetic clarity, seemed to say, racism may have caused African Americans to have the dual identities, but differences cannot be allowed to sever the ties between us if our shared project of dismantling oppression is to happen. When that piece became public in 2011, the notion of my destiny being related to and interdependent upon the destiny of others has long guided my life. I started my fascination with narratives and interest in people's stories long before I knew what that was. As a student, I was always interested in other people. Who are they, Mom? Where they come from? How do they know that? Where did they learn that? How did they become so good at that? I'm also someone who has always been interested in what is fair and equitable. My mother still says that my 4-year-old is giving me back exactly what I deserve. But in other words, I root for the underdog. As a student, I did not have a clue about where this orientation to the world developed. All I knew was that I have not always been known, or I did not always know how best to articulate or demonstrate those important aspects of my identity and my understanding of who I was as a student. You have all had me in class with you before. I was the young whippersnapper who knew everything. I imagine I came across to students and to teachers as a bull in a china shop, a bit cynical or angry as I shared my experiences and tried to connect what they were saying to my real life. You all have that experience, any of you? Okay. And if you can believe it or not, I was not as refined as I am now. Go figure. Being a graduate student in education taught me the skills and developed the capacities within me to talk about equity and to theorize about fairness and social justice that clearly outlined my collaborative sensibilities and my desires to learn from others. But it was not until I connected my life story to social justice that I was able to overcome the barriers that my upbringing created for me in working with people who were different from me. And I want you to think about that. We all have barriers that are part of our upbringing that create barriers in our abilities to work across differences. And it wasn't until I connected that story, or those barriers, to social justice that I was able to think about those critically. And so as I share my narrative with you, I want you to think of your own. If you believe that indeed we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny, I want you to ask yourself the following questions as I continue to talk. How does your narrative enhance your abilities and capacities to work for social justice? What are the barriers that your narrative has created that impede your abilities to work across cultural differences for social justice? All right, so who am I? Who are you? I'm not an artist, so I just borrowed these stick people from the web. So why narratives? Frank Lanier writes that because narrative and identity development heads directly to the heart of who someone understands himself to be, provides an empowering global context for which to respond to the challenges and satisfaction that work provides. The process directly supports and complements other internal development efforts by acting as a keystone for job-specific skill building, behavior modeling, and technical training. Importantly, narrative and identity development is concrete, it is process-driven, and results-oriented. If I start with my stick figure, okay, so here's it in circles, right? So if I start with this diagram, where the core is represented in the center, and that is me, then I have to understand the aspects of my life that have influenced me the most. Race, class, gender, outwardly socially constructed categories clearly have meaning. And these categories are a part of who I am. And while I was born with these certain identities, right, they are but a prelude to who I am and to my narrative and how I prescribe meaning to those categories. That is where the passion lies. So, what are my key influences? What are your key influences? Who's the personal self? I'm going to share a little bit about myself. This is just a little bit. So, I have a brother who's 16 months younger than I am. He and I were born to teenage parents. I was born and raised near a rural town in Virginia, and I identify mostly with that town. I lived there with my mother and her parents until I went to the 3rd grade. In the 3rd grade, my mother finished college, got a job at Philip Morris, and was able to provide a very middle-class suburban life for us. And so we moved. We left our rural community and moved to the suburbs of Richmond, Virginia. And my mother prioritized education. And so that's just a little bit about my personal life, about who I am. And if I just sat at a table and was talking to you about that part of my life, you would think, wow, that's a really interesting story. And you might think, wow, those narratives are really important. They help us guide, or in our context, they help us get to know each other. But there is an underside to how we think about narratives. And it's associated with narratives, but not the narratives in and of themselves. The problem is that we generally prescribe a single narrative to people. We prescribe to people who we don't personally know, but who we have to be in close contact with, a limited understanding of what these categories mean to them and to ourselves. So if you met me on the street, or if you just saw a part of my bio that said she was born to teenage parents, is that usually a good thing? Do we prescribe something good to that? Or do we think of that as something negative? It's seen as at risk. That's what we do to kids, right? They are automatically, based upon an identifier marker, put into a category that we identify them by. And so the idea that I would one day, before I'm 30 years old, have a PhD and work at a Research One institution wouldn't necessarily be a part of that narrative that you would think, because I was born to teenage parents. So just as important as prescribing a single narrative to others, we have this idea of how important our stories are. Reminds me that we oftentimes disengage from our own narratives. Those aspects of who we are that are rough around the edges and might, as I described earlier, offend others because they come off abrasive and inarticulate, and heaven forbid, unintelligent. We get rid of and discard any aspects of our narrative that make us different from the norm that's within the context in which we operate. I'm reminded of this idea. I work on a national grant where there are faculty coming from around the country to create online modules for educational leadership programs. And we're working on modules that are used to better support and prepare educational leaders to work with the leaders that are going to be out in the field, so that they can better prepare students of color and students who come from a poverty context. And as we work together, let's say over a work session of about 3 days, one of the exiting remarks from a dear colleague was that she didn't want us to just focus on race, right, as a part of these modules, that we were also there to support students who come from a poverty context. And I thought about that, and she was right. What had happened over those 3 days were that the people of color in that room had talked about the curriculum, had helped design the curriculum, had made connections to the curriculum from their own lived experiences, and no one in that room talked about having overcome poverty. Right? No one made a connection to their own lived experiences about having moved up in socioeconomic class. And I thought about that. And I said, I know for a fact that not every person who goes to college is middle class or upper middle class or rich. They're kids on scholarship. They're kids who work to go to school. But we have virtually rendered that narrative invisible. And we talk about who goes to college and who doesn't go to college based on what socioeconomic class they come from. And in that regard, we've succumbed to a master narrative, a single narrative of who educated people are. We cut the complexities and smooth out the edges, and as a result, we learn very little about how to work together, how to really work together, to really learn from each other. And as a writer once said, the problem with a single narrative is that it is incomplete. It is limited. A parent walks into your office and you have to counsel them about their child. How do you interact with them? Do you know their story? Do they know yours? One of the exercises that I have my students do at Duquesne, and I do this with undergraduates. I teach a course called Social Justice in Educational Context to sophomores. It's a wonderful class. It's one of the most favorite classes I teach. So if you're ever in Pittsburgh, come by. And one of the things that I have them do, and they're very young, so this is a hard assignment because they've never thought about themselves in these very personal ways. And so, you know, they're 20 years old and no one has ever said, who are you? What does race have to do with how you understand yourself and class and gender and all that? And so I have them do an assignment where they have to write the historical influence, how history has influenced their lives, how their biology has influenced their lives, cultural influence, and also the political. And it's amazing to hear. I mean, first of all, they're so young, right? I mean, they're talking about history, and my students last year, I think, were like in the 4th grade, 9/11, you know, so they're young. But those things have shaped how they know the world, right? In the same ways that some of the things that I will share with you later has really influenced how I've come to do my work. And so the question is, again, as you think about those barriers, as you think about your narrative, how have these 4 domains shaped your work? How do they shape your relationship to social justice and how you define it? And so if you want to, I have here the questions that I have them grapple with around geography and how they know micro and macro levels of impact in their lives. Their generational analysis, where they have to look at their ancestors and of what brought them to the place in which they find themselves at that moment in time. Have them think about the global aspects of what's going on around the world at different times. Biologically, have them think about their physical makeup, what they actually look like. This is very powerful for students who might have a physical disability or who have overcome some traumatic experiences in their life. Connecting their genes to relatives and to see where their dominant compositions come from, and how those things have not only impacted their lives, but also how they may change going forward. Culture, values, beliefs, and practices that they hold so dear and that guide their daily lives. What's the impact? Now, this assignment I took directly from my colleague Matt Militello from North Carolina State University, and he tells people to use it all the time. So if you're interested, again, just let me know. But this exercise reminds us again that the narrative is the categories that we fall in are one layer. The meaning we prescribe to those categories are another. So today, as we look at social justice and we think and ask, how can it serve? This is a frame for us to think about. I Googled social justice the other day, and there were nearly 1.2 million results, right? And everything from nursing to geography to architecture. There were some key words that appeared in the results: resources, rights, opportunities, inequalities. And it was all really quite interesting and fascinating, because what we had was this sort of blurred understanding of what social justice is by definition. And so what I want to offer to you as you continue to listen tonight is some understandings that I've come to over the last couple of years about what socially just educational leaders do. Right? So we won't get caught up in how do we define resources, because we know they're human resources, they're financial resources, there are all kinds of different resources, right? We know that there are rights and there are limits to people's rights and what's best for us at different times. We know that opportunities, right, are important to how people, whether or not people choose or take advantage of those available to them at a particular time. But what socially just educational leaders do is extraordinary when you walk into a building or when you walk into a room and you watch them in practice. And what they do are 3 central things. One, transformational educational leaders who practice socially just and put it into practice in their fields, they are transformational public intellectuals. They believe that the pedagogy in schools must focus on morally impacting the ends, meaning that there's a right and a wrong to how we interact with each other. Right? So they're morally impacted ends. 2, they are bridge people who are committed to creating a bridge between themselves and others for the purpose of improving the lives of all of those with whom they work. And 3, they are critical activists who deconstruct political, social, and economic inequity, and they organize communities and school resources to the central aim of providing opportunities for traditionally unrepresented and oppressed people. So they transform through their public work, they bridge to overcome gaps, and they deconstruct what has been done and try to make it better. And so if I go back and I look at that stick figure, right, and I'm trying to make meaning, and you're trying to make meaning as you go through your own questioning of the barriers. And I think about the historical, the cultural, and I think about the political and the biological narratives of my life, I discover that there are 3 guiding areas of my story that shape when and where I enter into social justice. I need only interrogate my narrative to find out. Those 4, and I've done this work with Jim in conversations recorded and transcribed, qualitative research project. The article comes out in the Handbook of Social Justice, hopefully in the next year or 2. But there are 4 areas that come out when I interrogate these 4 aspects of my narrative. 1, equity and excellence. 2, love, or as Jim Henderson would say, operationalizing the concept of humanity through a servant's heart. That sounds much better than love, right? 3, taking the risk to forgive. Right? And 4, being invested in reciprocal relationships across cultural differences. So how do I get to equity and excellence from this, right? From that stick figure at the beginning, from those questions. For me, in one way or another, equity has always been about resources and opportunities. In elementary school, I recall being very aware of those differences as I shared. Today, I am certain that that is because I was different. I was the new kid, and I befriended those who were different like me. They were the kids that people bullied. They were the kids who were just a little shy or a bit awkward and uncomfortable with their smarts. As socialization and assimilation quickly taught me, and I'm sure you learned this too, I learned that I needed to befriend the cool kids, those kids as well, so that I would not be miserable. It was an act of survival. I decided then and there that I would be a bridge. I didn't use that language, right? But I knew that that's what I was going to do. I would learn to navigate both worlds. Reflecting upon that time in my life, I realized that historically I was destined to be the bridge. My ancestry and family history would culminate in a time and space that demanded that I stretch myself in ways which would demand that in order to be successful, I would experience my schooling in ways that, by definition, gave meaning to the political decisions about race and education that were made before my birth. And here I'm talking about Brown v. Board of Education. In his book, Silent Covenants, Derek Bell writes, and I quote, "The world is moved by diverse powers and pressures, creating across currents that unpredictably, yet with eerie precision, determine the outcome of events. Often invisible in their influence, these forces shape our destinies, furthering our frustrations, our ambitions, and goals. The perfection for which we strive is elusive precisely because we are caught in a mirage of manifestations of perfection itself. From my earliest memories, my family and community charged me with the responsibility of crossing cultural boundaries, of mastering the codes of power without severing ties to my Southern African American community. Examples around me in the small rural community where I started school believed that I and all the other little kids in that building had the ability to change the world. At least that's how I felt. I grew up seeing people do things, and this was in my little small rural community school. They organized meetings, ran churches, made a living on farmland they owned. Like most adults from a child's view, they were larger than life. Even though the older people in the community had minimal formal education, the ways in which they engaged the world made them appear to be the smartest people ever. They demonstrated love, kindness, and respect. They taught me right from wrong. My grandfather, affectionately known as Papa, and Grandma raised 10 kids of their own, and they helped out with other kids. Anybody who happened to need help would come over. They sent all of their children to college, half of whom have advanced degrees. Their 18 grandchildren followed suit, going to college and obtaining advanced degrees. It was all quite normal. Nothing special, really. My grandmother doesn't talk about it like it's some big feat. It was the expectation. 1971, the year of my birth, was the year that all the schools in the state of Virginia were finally integrated. 17 years after Brown v. Board. Since Papa made Mom the sacrificial lamb, my mom was the one child who graduated from an integrated school. She integrated her high school. She was one of 4. It would seem only natural that once she had completed college and could afford a home in the suburbs, she would move my brother and I an hour away to go to one of the best school districts in the state. We left our small community school where my second grade teacher had taught at least 6 of my aunts and uncles and attended our church on second Sundays every month to go to the better school. Now, equate better to higher test scores, okay? Back in that time, right? That decision further sealed my destiny. Equity and excellence seemingly meant access to resources and opportunities. It meant exposure. In the 1970s and still today, this meant becoming fluent in the meaning-making structures of white culture. I would be enrolled in a racially mixed school, take honors classes, become class officer, and high school prom queen. Long, long time ago. I would learn without the benefit of what it actually meant how to balance excellence on the terms of a white dominant culture, all the while being tethered to my grandmother's porch. In many ways, I continue to grapple with the cross currents that Bell describes as determining the outcomes of events. In reality, I learned little to nothing about equity and excellence in majority schools that I attended after the 3rd grade because they failed to critically engage me in an inquiring way about resources and opportunity. I was to be happy that I was at that school, that by their definition, I was doing well. What I learned about equity and excellence, I learned by watching my grandmother and mother's generation engage racism and inequities head-on in their lives. My understandings of the collective ways in which historically oppressed groups persevere to obtain excellence was solidified by watching them remain engaged and hopeful in their quest for equity by taking actions each day to demonstrate their value and human self-worth in places where they were unwanted. As a result of such modeling, I learned that equity and excellence was never just about test scores and academic achievement. If it had been, then the people who I had held to be the most esteemed in my life by that definition would cease to be. And how could I, as a kid, prescribe to that definition if it meant that the people I loved would not be included. I share with you an example. When I started the 4th grade in the new good district, my teacher, the first 9 weeks, we were on a 9-week system, I'd gotten all A's in my reading, math, social studies, science, and I got a C in conduct. And I was so hurt. And so my mother she says, Gretchen, what's going on? And I was like, I don't know. So my mom makes an appointment to see the teacher. And she goes in and sees the teacher, and the teacher says, oh, Gretchen's an excellent student. What's the problem? And my mom says, well, she got a C in conduct. You know, she was ready to find out why and to punish me properly, right? So my teacher says, oh, you know, it's really quite all right. You know, Gretchen's just a little overeager. You know, she's just a bit excited. You know, she needs to just understand to calm down. And essentially what the teacher was saying is I was the kid who, you know, oh, I know, tell me, right? I was really excited about learning, and I was happy to be there. But I was a disturbance, and I need to understand how to respond and how to act in the classroom. And my conduct was not appropriate. My mother came home from that meeting with my teacher and said, Gretchen, it's okay to get C's in conduct in the 4th grade. I learned that equity and excellence, right, would come only when knowledge rooted in experience was used to shape what we value, and as a consequence, how we know what we know, as well as how we use what we know. That example from my mom was what taught me about being excellent and equitable, and it didn't matter what the grade was. So love, operationalizing the concept of humanity through a servant's heart. Somewhere in my informal learning at home, I have to put those two together, right? That's why I do this work. Somewhere in my informal learning at home and in community, I came to the understanding that the very people who cause you the most hurt and pain are the ones you have to love. Love them the most is a phrase somewhere in my consciousness, though honestly, I'm not sure who put it there. I attribute it to my grandma. There are days that I am distressed by how students are treated in classrooms, how inhumanely they are treated. I observe schools quite a bit, and when I'm in the classrooms, I am dismayed by how some of the educational decisions that the adults make negatively impact students' lives and experiences in very harmful ways. African Americans in the African American community, being treated inhumanely is a dark reality of our past, and so is resistance. What is often not exposed and talked about in today's mainstream educational discourse is how schooling continues to inflict such inhumanity on students through its structures and through its institutions. And I asked the question, is it any wonder that there are students who resist schooling in classrooms every day? I recalled how thrilled and angry I was when I was finally assigned African American literature as a required text in a class. Yes, it was in college, but for the first time, I was provided evidence of what my home community had told me about by a teacher, a real teacher in a formal educational setting. It was at that point that I was able to articulate why the better school district with the higher test scores had failed to connect equity and excellence. They had not engaged me at the level which I was human, at the level of my cultural self. In a book chapter entitled What's in a Myth? Qualitative Research as a Means of Recreating the World, I wrote about the popular myths of inadequate segregated schools and inferior black educators as a way of illustrating my own relationship to education and schooling more than 30 years after Brown v. Board. As the myth goes, and some of you may know this, African Americans were segregated in dilapidated school buildings without proper resources. That's like the overall narrative, right? By definition, the inferior accommodations house inferior education, including the teachers, the administrators, and the students. So goes the myth. Indeed, there's research that provides a different narrative, quite a bit. One where African Americans created extraordinary learning contexts, where success was measured by college attendance and subsequent career options. Remember my grandparents, 10 kids, all college graduates, advanced degrees. All of those kids attended segregated black schools. A merit scholar, Research One institutions, Ivy League schools, deans of schools of business, Harvard-educated businessmen, executives at Fortune 500. Those were all the results of their schooling experiences and educational contexts created by people who loved them. I have come to learn that lots of good outcomes are possible when educators love their students and are able to connect to their humanity. Consider the following quote taken from historian Elizabeth Higginbotham, who writes about the experiences of the first generation of African American college graduates from majority institutions. You know, it seems like when I talk particularly to my undergraduates, they think this is like so long ago, right? It really isn't, right? It really isn't. And it's amazing, you know, I'm talking about 60, 70 years. That's nothing. That's nothing. So the first generation of African American college student graduates, we have research now that talks about their experiences at majority schools. Instructing children, and Higginbotham describes this about parenting, instructing children to survive in a racist society is a complex and cumbersome task with a long tradition in the black community. As black children learn at an early age that their group is devalued in the wider society, black parents have to prepare their children both to recognize and handle racist situations. Racism has the potential to limit life chances and choices in the lives of black women and men. Thus, the expectations nurtured at home might reflect distant possibilities for individuals. Parents must be ready to provide support and encouragement to contradict the negative feedback their children will receive within schools and other mainstream institutions. Ideally, such encouragement and skills will enable black children to become adults who have the capacity to love and work with others despite the crippling effects of racism, end quote. Lack of an inclusive curriculum, disproportionate office referrals, and disproportionate referrals for special education, an educational achievement gap that is seemingly the norm, are commonplace daily assaults to the humanity of African American children. These assaults do not happen in the most distressed school districts. For African American students, they are just as likely to happen in what are considered to be the best districts as well. As a parent raising 2 children, I can attest to the thought and intentionality and prayer through which my husband and I navigate their education. As a parent and educator, there are far too many days when my son comes home talking about his day, and there's very little of what sounds like love happening in that building. My propensity to want to see the good in people leads me to believe that it is not that the educators do not have the capacity to love other people's children. Perhaps, just perhaps, the vast majority of them have lost hope in the educational process. As a researcher, as a teacher educator, and as a citizen in a democracy, I have long struggled with what it means to engage the dominant narrative. In my work with Dr. Hicks, we've written about what it means to teach for audacious hope and action. And we contend that hope and action are in a symbiotic relationship with each other. That in order for action to be taken, individuals must have a hope-filled frame of reference. You gotta believe that you're gonna have a good impact, right? The converse is also true, that to be hope-filled, one must act. The outcome of this generative cycle is akin to what philosopher Cornel West calls audacious hope, an expression of faith in the notion of progress when there is little evidence to suggest that an effort will produce a positive effect. Said another way, audacious hope is the recognition that some efforts are worth struggling for, even when doing so feels like raging against an unyielding machine. Educating in the service of others is a form of action. But working for social justice begs the questions, what if our educators have bought into the myth that dilapidated buildings, and think communities now, right? We're in 2012, think communities instead of those buildings, equal inferior parents, inferior children? What if our educators today have bought into the notion that those people don't care as much as we care and are somehow less human? How can they be hopeful if they bought into that single narrative? How can they take action? How can they plan? How has that narrative limited their capacity to love, their capacity to serve? There's some things to think about. So taking the risk to forgive. So this is the one that right now I'm working with and I'm learning so much with from my colleagues. If I am honest, I will admit that there are days that I'm very angry. And writing this and sharing this, and I hear it's going to be on YouTube, it's all very risky, right? People don't like angry black women. I don't know why, but they don't seem to like angry black women. But if I'm really truly honest, I will admit that coupled with that anger is a visceral sense of disappointment. Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream of this country's potential has not been realized, and we've made extraordinary advances, don't get me wrong. But all you have to do is visit some schools and you'll go, wow, there's a lot of work to do. As a representative of the positive outcomes of the Rosa Parks generation, I am a representative of the work that remains. Pragmatism put the African American community in a situation where the compromise to close our schools and leave our communities for a better life has proven less fruitful than imagined. In K through 12 schools, African American students are falling further and further behind. As a matter of fact, in the city of Pittsburgh, I heard a statistic not too long ago that said it would take another 40 years to close the achievement gap between white students and black students in that school district. And that's assuming that it continues the pace that it's currently going. You can always go back, you know, like you could always lose track in a year, right? So integration in that sense did not really transpire. For the most part, as we know, black schools were closed, black educators were fired, and black students were sent into hostile environments. And today our schools are just as segregated as they were in 1954. When we look at our schools, even if people are going to the same school, if they're in the same school buildings, we know that the ways in which they are tracked academically, it's like having schools within schools. So even though they may be in the same building, they're not in the same classrooms. And while I will never be as tired as my grandmother, who cooked and cleaned and washed clothes on a washboard for a family of 12 so that I could have a doctorate and be here talking to you, I am mentally tired. Tired because I was raised to believe that the equity and excellence and opportunities that they espouse, those tools were accessible to all. And in my work, and as I look at issues of social justice, and as I grapple with my own narrative in that context, it begs the question whether or not that is indeed true. I've also learned in my sort of risk learning to forgive that being the bridge is not enough. People whose knowledge and experiences are rooted in privilege have to be willing to be bridges as well. The idea of privilege suggests that people who benefit from and are thereby socialized in a worldview of power and influence without asking for those benefits have a different agenda to work on. Sanjay and his colleagues suggest that we all have mental models that help us to frame and interpret knowledge. Therefore, it is essential for those who have access to the power that privilege affords to work to better understand how power, coupled with privilege, operates. It is not enough for someone whose knowledge experience is not of privilege to state that inequities exist and that barriers continue to prevent equal opportunity. It is not enough for people from historically marginalized groups to sit at the table, share their stories, and be their bridge. It is not enough because what invariably happens is that the family I come from and my experiences are rendered invisible to members of privileged groups. All you see is a tenured professor in the room giving a speech. The history, the stories, the narratives are left outside the door. Rarely acknowledged are the barriers that were crossed by those families and the assaults that they endured so that students could continue to go to school. The denial of this reality is painful to accept, and this is why, and this is so important, this is why co-directing a Center for Social Justice with the likes of Jim Henderson is so important. It's about the relationships that one is able to create while doing this work, while constantly interrogating one's own narrative that makes the context more socially just. Reciprocal relationships. Relationships. We know that relationships matter in schools, right? All the research tells us that relationships matter. Relationships are where I have learned to trust that people have the capacity to change the world. I know this because in relationship with others is where I work to create my own ethic of risk. Doing so is a continuous process. So while you're going through your program and it feels like you're doing lots of work, it's just the beginning. In actuality, at this point in my life, I believe that creating an ethic of risk and leadership are toggled together by one's enactment of social justice. And let me explain. In relationships with people, as opposed to just being the bridge, I have refined the exceptional lessons taught to me by my family. I've made them better. First, I have redefined my understanding of responsible action. Growing up, responsible actions entail being better than the majority because that is what it took in order to have access to resources and opportunities. Striving for excellence served me well, but excellence without responsible action did not nourish my soul. In her text, A Feminist Ethic of Risk, Sharon Welch redefines responsible action as, quote, the creation of the conditions of possibility for desired changes. Responsible action as one works on the behalf of others suggests that context really matters. Over the years, I learned to pay very close attention to context if I am to carry out responsible actions that are inclusive of all stakeholders. I cannot be exclusive if I am committed to cultivating relationships. I have always been grounded in my community, another important concept in creating an ethic of risk. The relationships that I have cultivated over the years include a much larger, more extensive community. Working for social justice demands that I integrate my past, my present, and future narratives along with my understandings of community in order to lead for social justice and to learn from the interactions I have with others. I cannot isolate myself. Finally, witnessing others as they work to be authentic leaders for social justice has taught me to be a strategic risk taker. Strategic risk taker. Welch defines strategic risk taking as not the willingness of someone to risk their life, but the contribution that such an action will make in the imagination and courage of the resisting community. So if people think you'll do it, that is very supportive as well, right? So my early lessons of equity and excellence did provide me with access to resources and opportunities. My access to privilege has surely increased. As I work in urban schools and listen to young people describe the lack of hope they have in adults to do the things they feel will make a difference in their schooling experiences, I am reminded of my colleagues near and far, and some of the new ones that I've met here this week, who sustain my hope by their acts of resistance and strategic risk-taking. There are days, and I have written about those in the past, where my relationships with these courageous individuals sustain me. So I leave you with wanting you to ask more questions. In a recent leadership class, I encouraged the students to use their imaginations in order to take more risk. Actually, I encouraged them to dream big, to consider what they would do if the current barriers that impede them were removed. So I had them list out all the barriers and said, what would you do if they weren't there? They shared some extraordinary ideas about assisting families and communities, about right and education. They described a world where social justice was commonplace and everyday language. My question for them, what's stopping you? Maxine Green reminds us of the importance of the capacity to imagine our world as we think it should be. And she says, imagination, as it is well known, is the capacity that enables us to move through the barriers of the taken for granted and summon up alternative possibilities for living, for being in the world. It permits us to set aside, at least for a while, the stifling familiar and the banal. It opens us to visions of the possible rather than the predictable. It permits us, if we choose, to give our imaginations free play, to look at things as if they could be otherwise. Asking myself what I would do if I could create more socially just contexts encourages me to think big. Hearing about your work and your projects gives me hope. It forces me to reflect upon my own narrative and to imagine the possibilities when people believe that they are the very thing that will be the difference. Thank you so much.